You have used the distributive property to multiply a monomial by a polynomial. You can work backward to express a polynomial as the product of a monomial factor and a polynomial factor. So what we've done prior to this is that we have multiplied a monomial times a polynomial using the distributive property. So we could take w times 1.6w, which is 1.6w squared, and w times 6, which is 6w. Factoring is when you work backwards to figure out what polynomial function can be reversed into to be its simpler parts of a monomial and a polynomial. In other terms, here's the problem. We're going to reverse back to get to that being the answer. We do that, we want to simplify things into smaller parts because that is easier to do it that way when we comes to the next step, which is solving equations. And trying to solve equations when you factor into simpler parts is oftentimes easier than trying to solve the equation all at one time. So that's what you're going to practice on this assignment, is using the distributive property to factor polynomials. So we do that by trying to find the greatest common factor of the two terms. GCF is greatest common factor. So what are some numbers that goes into 27 and 18? Because those would be the factors of 27 and 18. Well, numbers that go into 27 and 18 that come to mind are 1, 3, and 9. We want to use the greatest common factor, and that would be the 9. So the largest number that goes into 27 and 18 is a 9. So I'm going to factor that out outside of a set of parentheses. And then I'll look at the variables. I see a y squared and a y. We can factor out a single y. We can't factor out a y squared because the second term only has a 1y available to be factored out. So only factor out the largest that each one allows. Then we got to figure out what's left inside of parentheses. And what's left of inside parentheses will be what you get when you divide 27y squared by 9y. And that will be 3y. And 18y divided by 9y is just 2. We're dividing because, remember, distributive property is multiplying. We can check this by multiplying 9y times 3y to see if it does equal 27y squared, which it does. 9y times 2 is 18y. So we do have this factored correctly. And the reason we were dividing is because the reverse of multiplication is division, and we're trying to figure out what the binomial is inside of the parentheses. The 1a is 15w minus 3v. So what goes into the 15 and 3? Well, a 3 does. So I will factor out a 3 outside of parentheses. What about the variables? Well, we have a w and a v, but since they don't have the same variable, we can't factor out either variable. So no variables gets factored out of this one. So then we start to divide. So 15w divided by 3 is 5w. And negative 3v divided by 3 is negative v. Question 1 below that, what goes into 21b and negative 15a? And that would be a 3 goes into both of those. Again, we can't factor out any of the variables because they don't have the same variable. So 21b divided by 3 is 7b, and negative 15a divided by 3 is negative 5a, and that is correctly factored. Question 2, what goes into 14c squared and 2c? Well, with 2 goes into both of them, and here's another one that both terms both contain at least one c, so we are going to factor out a c. And then we divide to figure out what's left inside parentheses. 14c squared divided by 2c is 7c. And 2c divided by 2c, well, 2c divided by 2c is just 1. So it is 2c parentheses 7c plus 1. Down here at the bottom, now we have 3 terms, and we have multiple variables. So the 3 coefficients are 10, 9, and there is a negative 1 in front of this g. So what goes into all 3 of those terms? Well, a 1 does, but I don't want to factor out a 1 because if you divide by 1, you're just going to wind up with the exact same thing that's already up here, which means you're not getting anywhere by factoring that. So we actually aren't going to factor out any of the numbers on this one. But we can factor out some of the variables because they all contain at least one g. The middle term only has one g, so I'll factor out a single g. And they all contain at least one h. And again, the last term only contains one h, so I can only factor out a single h. And then we divide to see what's left over inside of parentheses. So 10g squared h squared divided by gh would be 10. G squared divided by g is g. H squared divided by h is h. Plus 9. G divided by g, they cancel. G divided by g is just 1. H squared divided by h is just h. Minus, and then g squared divided by g is g. H divided by h is going to be 1, so they cancel each other out. So that is factored correctly. Then finally, question 4. What goes into 12, 6, and 2? Well, a 2 does. And all three terms contain at least one j. This one only has one j, so that means I can only factor out one j. And they all contain at least one k, but since the middle term only has one k to factor out, I can only factor out one of the k's. So 2jk gets factored out. And then we divide to see what's left over inside of parentheses. That will be 12 divided by 2 is 6. J divided by j would cancel. K squared divided by k would be k. Plus 6 divided by 2 is 3. J squared divided by j is j. The k's would cancel. Plus 2 divided by 2 is 1. And I'm not going to put a 1 down because I know there's going to be some other variables in that term. J squared divided by j is j. And k squared divided by k is k. So we get 2jk, parentheses 6k, plus 3j plus jk. And just because it's jk doesn't mean I'm not serious, because I am serious. That is the correct answer.